بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. Alhamdulillah. One of the great books of our civilization is known as al-Maktubat. It was written over 400 years ago by a man who was Shaykh Ahmed al-Faruqi al-Sarhindi, who's also known as Mujaddid al-Thani, the renewer of the second millennium. So he came at the outset of the second millennium of Islam. We're now in 1436. And basically he wrote this extraordinary work. And I recently received, I had a copy of it, but I recently received a copy that came to me. It was published in Turkey from Sibghatullah al-Mujaddidi, the great scholar and mujahid that fought against the Russians when they occupied his country. It's his great-grandfather, and Ahmed Sarhindi was also a Faruqi. He's from Sayyidina Omar's offspring. Really, truly extraordinary scholar. But one of his maktubat is the 19th maktub, and it was to Sayyid Al-Mir Muhammad Nu'man, and it was about patience and also being content with the decree of Allah. And in it he says, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen fi s-sarra'i wa dharra'i wa fi al-afiyati wal bala'i فعل الحكيم جل سلطانه لا يخلو عن حكمة. He begins praising Allah, the Lord of the worlds, in sarra and dharra, in hardship and in ease, in times of joy and times of sorrow, times of difficulty and times of ease, and then في العافية والبلاء, when one is in well-being and when one is in tribulation. Al-afiyah is one of the comprehensive Arabic words for simply well-being. When somebody has the afiyah, they're healthy, but it's also a psychological well-being, a spiritual well-being. It's a really beautiful word. Al-bala is the tribulation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in many verses in the Quran about bala, that the world is a tribulation, Allah will try us in the world. And the Prophet ﷺ said, أَشَدُّكُمْ بَلَاءً الْأَنْبِيَاء ثُمَّ الْأَمْثَلْ فَالْأَمْثَلْ, that the people that have the most tribulations in this world are the prophets, and then those closest to them. And there's a hadith also, إِذَا أَحَبَّ اللَّهُ قَوْمًا ابْتَلَاهُمْ. If Allah loves people, He gives them a lot of tribulations. And part of the wisdom of that is that He makes the world uncomfortable for the people He loves, because the world is not their natural resting place. It's not a place where He wants them to feel comfortable. So Allah will throw difficulties into your life. In fact, Sa'id Nursi actually says that sometimes He'll give you physical tribulations just so that you're uncomfortable, in order to want to get out of this world and meet your Lord and be with your Lord. So it says, فِعْلُ الْحَكِيمِ جَلَّ سُلْطَانُهُ لَا يَخْلُو عَنْ حِكْمَةٍ. The actions of the wise, Al-Hakim is one of the names of Allah, and it comes from حَكَمَ يَحْكُمُ, which is to judge a thing, and you need wisdom to judge. And so whatever He decrees is out of His wisdom. So He says no action of the Hakim is out of foolishness. It's always a wise thing. And then لَعَلَّ اللَّهَ يُرِيدُ بِهِ الصَّلَاحِ, that God can do something that you think is not a good thing for you, but He's actually doing it to rectify you or to bring about some rectification. And then he quotes the Quran, وَعَسَى أَن تَكْرَهُ شَيْئًا وَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ وَعَسَى أَن تُحِبُّوا شَيْئًا وَهُوَ شَرٌ لَكُمْ وَاللَّهُ يَعْلَمُ وَأَنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. So he says that maybe, and this is from the Quran, maybe you detest a thing and in it is good for you, and maybe you love a thing and in it is harm for you. And God knows, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows, and you don't know. So that's the operative meaning to take from that, is that you have to trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that what's happening to you is happening for a wisdom, because He is Al-Hakim. So then he says, and this is the advice of Sayyid Ahmed Sarhindi, فَاصْبِرُوا عَلَى بَلَائِهِ وَارْضَوْا بِقَضَائِهِ. Be patient with the tribulations He gives you, but also be content with His decree. Be content with His decree, because the sakhat, being angry at the decree of Allah, is one of the deepest sicknesses of the heart. Subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَاثْبُتُوا عَلَى طَاعَاتِهِ وَاجْتَنِبُوا عَنْ مَعَاصِيهِ. And also be firmly resolute in your obediences to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and avoid any disobediences. Subhanahu, inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. This is what people who believe in Allah say when إِذَا أَصَابَتْهُمْ مُصِيبَةٌ. When they're afflicted by any calamity, they say, inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. We belong to Allah and to Him we're returning. So these calamities are from Him to remind us and to bring us back to Him. قال الله تبارك وتعالى وما أصابكم من مصيبة فبما كسبت أيديكم ويعفو عن كثير. That no calamity afflicts you except it's from what your own hands have wrought. In other words, any tribulation that comes to us as a species and us as individuals, we actually deserve it. وَيَعْفُ عَنْ كَثِيرٍ. And He forgives much. He forgives much that He's doing. And so that's another really important thing to remember, is that everything that afflicts us comes from our own selves. And yet He forgives many, many things. So this is one of the foundational metaphysical principles that the Quran has. And it's very important for Muslims to remember that, because a lot of Muslims now tend to want to blame things outside of themselves and always look that it's somewhere else. If you read the Quran, what you'll find is that the person that blames in the Quran is Iblis. And the person that takes responsibility is Adam alayhi salam. And this is why Adam was given the Khilafah, the Caliphate, over Iblis. Because Iblis blames, he even blames Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, بِمَا أَغْوَيْتَنِي لَأَغْوِيَنَّهُمْ أَجْمَعِينَ. Because you led me astray. This is what Iblis says to God. Because you led me astray, I'm going to lead all of them astray. This is a sickness, it's a disease of blaming the other for what happens. This doesn't mean that there is not wrongs and rights in the world. And a lot of people confuse this, because you can look at things at the political level, and then you can look at them at the metaphysical level. If you look at them at the political level, you have to deal with them as political problems. So there are oppressors and there are oppressed. There's right and there's wrong. But if you look at things at the deeper level, which is the metaphysical level, it enables you then to grapple with right and wrong in a way that doesn't destroy your heart. But if you forget that balance, it's having bifocular vision. It's having, when you have glasses, some people need bifocals, so you can see far and then you can see close. The political is looking close, but the metaphysical is looking far. And so this is not denying that there are egregious wrongs being done by some people against others. But spiritually, how do we understand those wrongs? That's the metaphysical question, and that's really what he's addressing here at the level. And this was the level that the Muslims were operating on in the past. And it's something that we've lost because we've become a political community instead of a metaphysical community. And by metaphysics here, I'm really talking about the spiritual and the deep understanding of the reason for existence, the reason for tribulation. These are the things the Quran, in essence, is explaining these things, and it takes a great deal of effort to really understand them at a deep level. So he says that no calamity comes except it's what your own hands have wrought. And this is also reiterated in several verses in the Quran. In Surah Al-Rum, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that ظهر الفساد في البر والبحر بما كسبت أيدي الناس. That corruption or pollution, fasad has a lot of meanings in Arabic, has manifested on the land and in the sea because of what humanity's own hands have earned, because of what they were doing. So this fasad that appears in the world is from what people were doing. لِيُذِيقُهُمْ بَعْضَ الَّذِي عَمِلُوا, in order to let them taste some of what they were doing. So the corruption that ensues from wrong action is in order for us to taste some of what we were doing, لَعَلَّهُمْ يَرْجِعُونَ, that perhaps they might go back to God, might make tawbah, might ask for forgiveness. So the things that happen to us are to bring us back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is very difficult for people to understand, but this is a reality. And then he says, فَتُوبُوا إِلَى اللَّهِ سُبْحَانَهُ وَتَعَالَى وَاسْتَغْفِرُوا عَمَّا كَسَبَتْ أَيْدِينَا. So turn back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and ask forgiveness of what our own hands have earned. وَسَلَ الْعَفُوَ وَالْعَافِيَةَ, and ask God for pardon and well-being. because those come from Allah, min Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فإنه تعالى يحب العفو واجتنبوا عن البلاء ما استطعتم. And also avoid calamities and tribulations as much as you're able to, because we can actually bring these things upon ourselves. So we bring calamities upon ourselves, and then we blame others for it. It's like somebody who, they eat poorly, and they don't exercise, and all these, they do horrible things, they don't rest enough, and then they get sick, and they say, oh, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has tried me with illness. The reality of it is you made yourself ill. So if you were exercising, if you were eating well, if you were getting good sleep, if you were doing all the right things, and then you get sick, that's ibtida from Allah. But if you aren't doing any of those things, and then you get sick, you have no one to blame but yourself. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ said, "Man wajada khayran falyahmadillah, wa man wajada ghayra dhalika fala yalumanna illa nafsa." That the Prophet ﷺ said, whoever finds good, let him praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because all good is from Allah. But whoever finds other than good, let him only blame himself. This is a sahih hadith. So then he says, don't take on tribulation more than you can bear. فَإِنَّ الْفِرَارَ مِمَّا لَا يُطَاقُ مِنْ سُنَنَ الْمُرْسَلِينَ عَلَيْهِمْ الصَّلَوَاتُ وَالتَّسْلِيمَاتِ. Because fleeing from what one is unable to bear is from the sunan of the messengers, is from the way of the prophets and the messengers. In other words, the Prophet ﷺ, he made hijrah because it was becoming impossible for them to live in Mecca because of the tribulations that were there. The Prophet ﷺ left, he was told by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make hijrah to Medina, but this is a teaching for us. وَلَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ إِسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ. You have in the Messenger of Allah the best example. So this is a teaching for us to understand that the Prophet ﷺ, he fled tribulations that he couldn't bear, and he taught people to do this. And this is why when some of his soldiers fled a situation where they were overwhelmed, the odds were against them, some of the Sahaba, when they got back to Medina, they blamed them and said, oh, you fled the battlefield. He said, no, what they did was, that was the right thing to do. He said they weren't farin, they were karin. They were people going to fight another day. And so that's important for people not to take on tribulations that they can't bear, and to flee from situations that will overwhelm them and test them. And a lot of our young people need to learn this. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Al-mu'minu la yudhillu nafsahu." The believer will never humiliate himself. And Sidi Ahmed Zarruq and others have said that it's when you actually go up against odds that are overwhelmingly against you. And for instance, if you go into a combative situation where the odds are overwhelmingly against you, and then you're humiliated by it. The people that you have, there's a story about a man, he used to be able to crack a whip, and he was on a carriage, and he was sitting with another man, and they passed by a little gopher, and he cracked his whip and killed the gopher. And then they passed by, there was a bird, he cracked the whip and he killed the bird. And then they saw a hornet's nest, and the man sitting with him, he said, let's see you get that. And he said, no, they're organized. Right? So you can take out these single individuals, but if you go up against hornets, right, wasps, called wasps, right? Yeah, people should know what a wasp is, because a wasp is the natural enemy of a bee. Bees are beautiful creatures because they produce two things, honey and wax. Honey, which is nourishment for the bodies and a healing, a medicine, so it's medicinal. And then wax is what candles are made of, that light up houses, they illumine houses. This is what bees do. But wasps are the natural enemy of bees. A bee will only sting you in self-defense. And because a bee is such an extraordinary creature, it gives its life in self-defense for other bees. So it will literally embed its stinger. It will embed its stinger in the one that it's defending itself against and die because of that. Whereas a wasp will sting you multiple times. It doesn't give up its stinger. So that's something to think about for Muslims, that Muslims are intelligent people historically. It doesn't mean they're always intelligent, but a Muslim by definition should be aqil. أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ. Don't you use your intellects. So, وَنَحْنُ فِي عَيْنَ الْبَلَى. And then he says, we are in the عَيْنَ الْبَلَى, in the world. We're in the source of tribulation. The very nature of the world is tribulation. لِيَبْلُوكُمْ أَيُّكُمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا. So the world is tribulation. مَعْ الْعَافِيَةِ. And yet we are in it in well-being. And this is a great gift from Allah, is to ask Allah for well-being. The Prophet ﷺ asked Allah, اللهم إني أسألك العفو والعافية والمعافاة الدائمة في ديني ودنياي وأهلي ومالي واستر عوراتي وآمن روعتي واحفظني بين يدي من خلفي وعن يميني وعن شمالي ومن فوقي وأعوذ بك أن أختار من تحتي. That dua was said after every single prayer in one recension. So the Prophet ﷺ said that dua, I ask you for pardon and for well-being and for continuous well-being, and for protection, to protect me in front of me, behind me, on the left of me, to the right of me, protect me from being assassinated or killed from underneath me, like mines and these horrible things. Asking Allah for afiyah is very important. The Prophet asked for afiyah every single day. فَلِلَّهِ سُبْحَانَهُ الْحَمْدُ وَالْمِنَّةُ وَالسَّلَامُ عَلَيْكُمْ وَعَلَى سَائِرِ مَنِ اتَّبَعَ الْهُدَى وَالْتَزَمْ مُتَابَعَةَ الْمُصْطَفَى. So peace be upon you and on all those who follow the guidance and cling to following al-Mustafa sallallahu alayhi wa sallam alayhi wa ala alihi as-salawatu wa taslimatu al-ula. Alhamdulillah. Jazakumullah khairan.